It was a bright, burning afternoon in the heart of Wagadugu, the capital of Burkina Faso. The city buzzed with the usual rhythm, market cries, the hum of motorbikes, the chatter of school children. At the edge of this ordinary scene, an extraordinary moment was about to unfold. A presidential convoy waited, polished engines rumbling low, while a man slumped against a cracked wall, cup in hand, invisible to the crowd. The world walked by, yet fate had other plans. President Ibrahim Traoré, fresh from a school visit, turned his head and froze. The beggar's weary eyes told a story that words could hardly capture. Recognition struck. This was not just any man, it was Musa, once his friend, once a scholar, now a shadow of both. What follows is more than chance. It is the collision of memory, betrayal, dignity, and redemption. It is about how one leader chose to see and one forgotten man chose to rise. Stay with us, because this story is not simply about survival, but about Africa's unbroken spirit. Subscribe and journey with us for a future that our ancestors prayed to see. The afternoon sun hung heavy over Wagadugu, its heat pressing down on every stone, every passerby, every weary face. President Ibrahim Traoré had just stepped out from a modest schoolyard where he had spoken with children about dreams and duty. His security detail moved with quiet precision, the convoy polished and waiting, eager to return him to the palace. Yet in that moment, destiny placed before him a sight no guard could block. Against a crumbling wall sat a man whose figure seemed more shadow than flesh. His shirt clung with sweat and dirt, trousers ripped at the knees, bare feet hardened by the streets. A tin cup, empty and dull, rested before him. To the crowd he was unseen, just another beggar in a city that carried too many wounds. But when Ibrahim's gaze lingered, the familiar crease of a brow, the tired flicker of eyes, stirred memory. He halted. "Wait here," he commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through protest. The man looked up, and disbelief spilled from cracked lips. "Ibrahim!" The sound was fragile, yet it carried the weight of years. The president's chest tightened. "Musa!" He moved closer, recognition complete. This was the friend who once sat beside him in classrooms, who had lent him books when he had none, who shielded him from the jeers of bullies. Now he was unrecognizable. Musa tried to rise, but his knees trembled. Ibrahim grasped his shoulder firmly. "It is me," he said with quiet certainty. "What happened to you?" At first Musa resisted. His eyes filled, then cleared as shame fought with hunger. "It is a long story," he whispered. "Not one I ever thought I would tell you. Not like this." But Ibrahim would not be turned away. "You are my friend. That is what matters." Within minutes, Musa was seated in the presidential residence, washed and clothed, a table before him laden with warm bread and fragrant stews. He ate cautiously, as if afraid the food would vanish. Between bites, his eyes shifted between gratitude and disbelief. When the plates were cleared, Ibrahim poured 2 glasses of juice, his own untouched as he leaned forward. "Now tell me, you were one of the brightest men I knew. What happened?" Musa stared at the glass, his voice breaking as he began. 3 years earlier, he had been the respected headmaster of a secondary school in Dioulasso. From his modest savings, he had built a small house, proud of his achievement, and he had married a woman named Stella. At first, life seemed steady. "We were happy," he said softly, "or I thought we were." But she grew distant, always on her phone, quick to anger. I ignored the signs. One afternoon, he returned home unexpectedly and found her with another man in their bed. His hands trembled as he recalled the moment. I could not fight. I walked out, shaking. She followed me, not with apology, but with contempt. She told me it was over, that he was the one she loved, and that I must leave the house I had built. Ibrahim's jaw set. "Leave your own home?" "Yes," Musa continued bitterly. "When I refused, she took me to court. She produced false documents claiming she had paid for the house. The judge believed her. I was cast out. His troubles did not end there. Lawyers drained what savings remained. With shame pressing in, he lost his job. Colleagues who once respected him kept their distance. Friends offered couches for a time, but pride and despair drove him away. Soon he was beneath bridges, surviving on scraps, unseen, unwanted. Every night I closed my eyes, he whispered, and I saw her laughing with him. His voice faltered, tears sliding unchecked. I wanted to die, Ibrahim. I truly wanted to die. The president rose slowly, the weight of the confession heavy in the air. He placed a steady hand on Musa's shoulder, his words low, yet filled with resolve. You did not deserve any of this, but your story will not end here. I promise you that. For the first time in years, Musa allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. That night he slept in a clean bed. The ache of hunger, replaced by the quiet of dignity, returned. And though the palace papers lay untouched on Ibrahim's desk, the young leader's mind fixed not on policy, but on the man who had once stood beside him, urging him to dream. The next morning, Musa awoke to warm bread, folded clothes, and the thought that yesterday he had been invisible, and today he was a guest of the nation's president. He asked himself, what would tomorrow bring? In the days that followed, Ibrahim's promise was not mere words. He arranged for doctors to examine Musa, for barbers to restore his appearance, and for tailors to provide clothes that fit with dignity. When Musa stood before the mirror, hair trimmed, body cleansed, and a spark in his eyes that had been long extinguished, he barely recognized the reflection. Ibrahim's next step was bold. He drove Musa to the edge of the city where a modest cream and brown house stood, its small garden neat, its door freshly painted. Musa's voice faltered as he whispered, "Whose house is this?" "It is yours," Ibrahim replied simply. "Paid in full. No one can take it away." Musa's hands trembled. "Why would you do this for me?" The president's gaze softened. "Because I remember who you are. You gave me books when I had none. You defended me when I was alone. You believed in me before I believed in myself. Now I do the same." Inside, the home was warm, its rooms filled with light. More awaited. Ibrahim had arranged for a small bookshop and school supply store beside a secondary school. "You will run it," he explained. "I know your love for education. Let us put it to use." Musa could scarcely speak. His tears this time were not born of shame, but of hope. The shop opened with quiet fanfare. At first, customers came cautiously, unsure of the man they once passed by on the streets. But Musa greeted each with respect. He guided students not just to notebooks and pens, but to knowledge itself, reminding them, do not memorize alone. Understand, and the answer will come. Soon his reputation spread. Parents nodded in approval, teachers stopped to exchange words, and children smiled at Mr. Musa. No longer invisible but reborn, the city that had once looked away now looked to him with respect. Yet destiny tested him again. One Saturday afternoon, while Musa arranged stacks of textbooks, a familiar voice broke the rhythm. "Musa!" He turned and the book nearly slipped from his hands. At the doorway stood Stella. Her once bright clothes were now plain, her jewelry gone, her face drawn. Beside her lay a small suitcase. "We need to talk," she said softly. Musa's chest tightened, memories rushing back like a storm. He stepped outside, folding his arms. "What do you want, Stella?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I have nowhere to go. The man I chose over you. He sold the house, emptied my account, and ran off with another woman. I lost everything." Her voice cracked. "Please, Musa. Just a room, just for a while." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. This was the woman who had once mocked him, who had stood in court with lies that destroyed his life. Now she stood stripped of pride, asking for mercy. "I forgave you long ago," Musa said evenly, "but I have moved on. My life is peaceful now. You chose your road, and I have chosen mine. Please," she whispered, "even a small space." Musa shook his head. "This is not your home. I wish you well, but you cannot stay." With steady steps, he returned inside, heart pounding but unbroken. That evening, he called Ibrahim. "She came back," he said quietly. "And what did you do?" "I told her no." On the other end of the line, Ibrahim's voice carried a smile. "I am proud of you, Musa. You did not just regain a house, you regained your dignity." The test had come, and Musa had stood firm. He was no longer the broken man slumped against a wall. He was a man restored, a friend renewed, and a citizen reborn. But fate was not finished with him. A new chapter waited, one that would take his story from a quiet shop to the heart of the nation. Weeks turned into months, and Musa's life took on a rhythm he had once thought forever lost. Each morning, he opened the shutters of his bookshop, swept the floor, and greeted the students who poured in for pens, paper, and hope. Parents began to send their children not only for supplies but for advice, for encouragement, for a word from the man who had lived through darkness and emerged whole. Soon, Musa was no longer just a shopkeeper. He was a mentor. He corrected a boy's mathematics problem, reminded a girl not to give up on her essays, and taught another that discipline was worth more than brilliance without effort. Whispers grew. Musa is back, not the beggar, not the broken man, but the teacher once more. From these whispers grew something larger. Men who had lost their homes, jobs, and families began to visit him quietly, drawn by the knowledge that he had once been where they stood. Musa listened, counseled, and shared bread with them. He understood their silence, their shame, their unspoken despair. And slowly, with Ibrahim's support, he created something new, the Musa Foundation. The foundation was modest at first, a single rented hall, a few donated chairs, some second-hand tools. But what it offered was more precious than gold, a path back to dignity. Men who had once begged on the roadside now learned carpentry, barbering, cooking, and simple business skills. Musa himself led classes on discipline and resilience. "I was once where you are," he told them, "but one hand lifted me, and now I offer mine." Within a year, the change was visible. Across Wagadugu, stalls opened, small food stands, barber shops, mechanics repairing motorbikes. Each one bore the quiet fingerprint of Musa's story, and with each success, the community began to believe anew in the possibility of restoration. This ripple did not remain social alone. It carried political weight. Commentators noted how one act of compassion by the president had sparked not just the saving of a single man, but the reawakening of dozens, then hundreds. Some called it a quiet revolution, the reminder that leadership was not only speeches and decrees, but the lifting of the forgotten. In markets, women whispered that Ibrahim Traoré was not like other leaders. He had not only fought against foreign influence, he had fought for the dignity of one broken citizen, and in that act he mirrored the larger dream for Burkina Faso, a nation where no one is too small to matter. The Musa Foundation became a symbol. It carried weight in sermons, in street conversations, in the hopeful eyes of youth. Musa himself, once hidden in shame, was now invited to speak at schools, community meetings, and even small rallies. He never sought glory. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of lived truth. The story also ignited political reflection. If one man, aided by a leader's kindness, could rebuild from nothing, then what of an entire people? Could nations broken by exploitation, betrayal, and corruption also rise? Could the spirit of Africa, long bruised, heal with the same dignity Musa had regained? People began to see Musa not just as a man, but as a metaphor, a testimony that collapse was not final. His life became a parable for a continent struggling to restore its pride and independence. But with growing recognition came greater questions. Could Musa's model spread beyond Wagadugu? Could his foundation inspire reforms across the nation? And what would happen when international powers, long invested in keeping Africa weak, noticed that dignity was returning at the grassroots? For Musa, these questions were too vast to answer alone. He remained humble, tending to his shop by day and the foundation by night. Yet deep within, he understood. His story had moved from personal pain to national purpose. And so the question rests with us all. If you believe Africa needs more leaders who lift the forgotten ones, type Africa Rise in the comments below. The journey was far from over, for as Musa's voice grew, the world beyond Burkina Faso began to listen. Beyond the streets of Wagadugu, Musa's story began to ripple outward. Local newspapers carried the account of the former headmaster who had once begged on pavements but now ran a thriving shop and foundation. Soon, foreign correspondents picked it up, not as a headline of war or instability, which so often dominates African news, but as a tale of redemption. Yet the framing differed. In Western media, the story was painted as a curiosity, almost a rarity, a lucky beggar lifted by a benevolent leader. What they often missed was its deeper meaning, that this act was not charity but justice, not a gift but the restoration of dignity. For in Burkina Faso, people understood it as something more powerful, an echo of Thomas Sankora's vision, where leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with the forgotten. Analysts in America discussed Ibrahim Traoré cautiously. Some praised his youth and energy, noting his connection to the people. Others raised concerns, questioning whether his defiance of foreign influence, particularly France, might push the nation closer to Russia. Yet behind the geopolitics, one simple truth resonated. A president had stopped for a beggar, and in doing so, reminded the world that leadership is first human. Across Africa, the story stirred conversations about what genuine revolution looks like. Was it always about soldiers and speeches? Or could it be as quiet as giving a man back his home, his work, his dignity? Commentators called Musa's restoration a micro-revolution, a small act that embodied the larger fight for Africa's right to self-determination. In Washington, think tanks speculated on whether such narratives could shift perceptions of the continent. The youth see Ibrahim Traoré as a Sankara reborn, one report warned. He commands loyalty not only through politics, but through personal gestures that resonate at the grassroots. For American policymakers, that loyalty represented both a challenge and an opportunity, a challenge to old systems of influence, and an opportunity to engage with Africa on new terms of respect. Meanwhile, in Paris and Brussels, the story was met with silence. European outlets downplayed it, preferring to highlight instability in the Sahel rather than dignity restored in Burkina Faso. It was a silence louder than words, for it showed that the narrative of African resilience was not one easily embraced by those accustomed to telling stories of dependency. But within Africa itself, the meaning was clear. Musa's testimony was more than one man's revival. It was a mirror held up to a continent long dismissed. If a man left in the dust could rise again, could not nations long exploited do the same? The world was listening, but perhaps not yet understanding. For Musa's voice was only beginning to travel, and soon it would echo beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. When Musa stepped onto the stage at the National Youth Conference, the hall fell into an expectant hush. Dressed in a neat gray suit, his shoulders straight, he no longer carried the bent frame of a man crushed by shame. Applause rose, not thunderous, but steady and warm, respectful of a man who had earned his place not through wealth or politics, but through endurance. "I was a man who lost everything," he began, his voice measured but firm. "Not because I was lazy or foolish, but because I trusted the wrong person. My wife and her lover took what I built, and I was cast out, mocked, left with nothing but despair. Yet one afternoon, as I sat hungry on the street, a friend I once helped found me. He did not pass me by. He lifted me up, and he reminded me that broken things can still be made beautiful again." The hall listened in silence. For many young people, Musa's words carried more weight than any policy speech. He was living proof that the lowest point is not the final one. His message was simple: your story can change if you refuse to surrender. For Burkina Faso, this moment became a parable of its own struggle. Just as Musa had been betrayed, cast aside, and left in ruins, so too had the nation endured decades of exploitation, corruption, and abandonment by those who promised love but delivered chains. And just as Musa found strength through dignity restored, so too could the nation reclaim its future. The path ahead was not easy. There were risks, economic sanctions, pressure from outside powers, the endless threat of instability in the Sahel. But there were opportunities too, building systems rooted in self-reliance, forging alliances based on respect, nurturing leaders who saw not only the powerful, but the forgotten. Musa's foundation grew as a symbol of this vision. From one man's rescue rose a network of hope, proof that revolution does not always roar with gunfire. Sometimes it begins with a quiet act of kindness. And for Africa, long burdened with the weight of colonial scars, the lesson was clear. The road forward must be chosen by its own people, grounded in dignity, justice, and community. That evening after the conference, Musa walked in the garden with Grace and little Rachel. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the stars glowed above. Grace whispered, "Do you think Africa can really rise?" Musa looked at her, then at the child running ahead. "I know it can, because I am standing here when I once thought I would never rise again." The choice, then, belongs not to fate, but to the people. For if a man once discarded could rebuild, then so too could a continent once broken reclaim its light. And from the lips of a humble shopkeeper turned mentor came a message to all of Africa. The fall is never final. The rise is always possible. From a cracked wall in the heat of Wagadugu to the bright stage of the National Youth Conference, Musa's journey was nothing short of a resurrection. He had once been a man stripped of his home, his work, and his dignity. Yet through one act of kindness, his life was rewritten, not merely restored, but transformed into a beacon for others who walked the same path of despair. The story was never only about Musa. It was about the unseen, the unheard, the countless souls across Africa who believe they are forgotten. It was about what happens when leadership refuses to look away, when a hand is stretched not for power, but for compassion. President Ibrahim Traoré showed the world that true authority is not measured by distance from the people, but by the willingness to kneel beside them. And from Musa's quiet triumph rose a wider message, that the fate of a nation, even the fate of a continent, can shift through dignity restored. Burkina Faso, long portrayed as fragile, here became a stage for resilience. In Musa's reflection, the nation itself was seen, wounded, betrayed, yet unbroken, and capable of rising again. For those who watched, especially the elders whose prayers have carried generations, the lesson is timeless. No betrayal, no fall, no humiliation is ever final. As Musa reminded the youth, broken things can indeed be made beautiful again. That truth belongs not just to one man, but to an entire people ready to stand tall. So the question now turns to you. Will you let Musa's testimony end here as a story? Or will you carry it as a challenge, that no matter how far you fall, you too can rise? If this story stirs something in your heart, do not let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe, for the voice of Africa must never be muted again. Together we declare, Africa can do it. Africa will rise. And when the world looks back, it will see not only Ibrahim Traoré or Musa, but a continent that chose hope, dignity, and the courage to begin again.